We talked a little bit about first causes, and just by way of review, it's hard for nature to generate nature. Okay, naturalism states that you have to have something within nature to cause some natural cause or some natural law to generate the universe. It's kind of like picking yourself up by your own bootstraps. It's very hard to have a natural law when natural laws depend on nature to be in existence. One of the first laws that we know of, law of thermodynamics, first law of thermodynamics, matter cannot be created or destroyed. And so just to pull matter out of nothing is one area where you have a hard time getting around that first law. And you have to kind of suspend that and say, well, the laws just didn't apply back then. But then you're really cutting yourself loose from the laws that we know, physical laws that we know. And we know that matter doesn't come out of nothing. Okay. Secondly, first cause of first life and subsequent life, we need to ask ourselves the question, can natural processes account for simple biological life, as in the simplest conceivable biological life? You've heard of maybe the early Earth simulation experiments, primordial soup experiments, and there's a lot of talk about that. But let's just look at some of the facts. I wanted to, need to do slideshow here. I'm kind of set up a little awkward here, but this is, let's look at the details of a minimally complex cell. The simplest cell that we know of is Mycoplasma genitalium. It's got 482 proteins. Now, according to some minimal complexity experiments, it's conceivable, and this is kind of hypothetical, to have a cell that's stripped down to a little more than half the number of proteins that mycoplasma has. Now, mycoplasma is a very pampered cell. It's an intracellular parasite. It doesn't have to earn a living, doesn't have to manufacture a lot of it's living in a cell, so it can derive a lot of its nutrients from the host cell. And so it can have a very stripped down number of proteins. But even if we grant 250 proteins as a very minimal cell, we need to ask, just from a probability standpoint, what are the odds of one specified protein forming by chance? And a guy named Doug Axe, who did his dissertation at Cambridge in both in molecular biology, but he was focusing on probabilities of proteins forming by chance. Because in the very first cell, you can't rely on this all what we call the translational machinery that we see in cells today, ribosomes, you've got DNA, RNA. You're assuming a lot of machinery there and information to encode a protein. In a first cell, you've got to rely on basically the proteins coming together simply by brute chance, okay? And he basically was looking at amino acid sequence space. Now, if you think of phone numbers, you could make a lot of phone numbers with, just your 9-digit phone number with the 10 digits we have, 0 through 9. There's a lot of phone numbers you can make. Now imagine you can make, let's say there are phone numbers that were 150 numbers long, and you only have 10 digits. The numbers, I mean, if you're a statistician, you can figure out the numbers of possible sequences you can have when you can use any one of those digits any number of times in any order. Okay, so he was looking at protein sequence space, and it's a number that's beyond reckoning. And he says, and then he also figured out what are the sequences that can actually have functional specificity, where it can actually fold up into biologically functional proteins. And he basically said, okay, give a protein of a modest length protein of 150 amino acids. Okay, 150 amino acids, but not just any sequence, but a sequence that has a particular, a protein of a particular sequence that has biological functionality to it. Okay, 150 amino acids long. Okay, he figured out the chances of something that has a specified sequence at 1 chance in 10 to the 74th power. That's just getting 150 amino acids in the right sequence. But on top of that, you have to have L amino acids, because there's 2 stereoisomers, D and L. So L amino acids is 1 in 10 to the 45th. Only peptide bonds is also 1 to 10 to the 45th power. Now, I've got the paper and the citation for it, so if you want to read his results, and also, well, I'll get to those in a bit. Just one protein forming by chance is 1 in 10 to the 164th power, because you add up all those exponents, all L, all peptide bonds, and it can't be a random sequence. It has to have a specified sequence for it to be a functional protein. Now that's just one. Now that number is mind-boggling if you know anything about exponents. 10 to the 80th subatomic particles in the known universe. Okay? It's hard to wrap your mind around. I tell my students when I'm teaching A&P that blood cell, one red blood cell's got 250 million hemoglobin molecules in it. And hemoglobin is a big protein with 570 amino acids. Okay, so you've got 570 some amino acids. So when we're talking 10 to the 80th subatomic particles, that's a number it's very hard to get your mind around. Now protein forming by chance, just a modest length, and some proteins are way bigger, like RNA polymerase, like 3,000 amino acids. Okay, so that's a modest protein forming by chance in the primordial soup, is that probability. Now, you can't just form one. Okay, you just can't form one. You have to form at least 250 if we go with the minimal complex cell. You have to have at least 250, and they all have to form in the same place so that they can interact with each other. Now that's a very, very modest number. It's actually, the probability is way worse because you can't just have one protein of each. Okay, if you look at the cell, you have to have multiple copies of certain proteins, multiple copies of other proteins. They all have to be made in the right quantities, in the right place, the right time, within the same cell. Now you can say, well, it just happened. If you're a naturalist, you can't just say it just happened. You have to deal with these numbers, okay? You have to. If you basically, in order to do the 250 proteins, you have to add the 164 or multiply it 250 times, which gives you a probability of a simple protocell with 250 proteins, each of 150 amino acids each, is 1 in 10 to the 41,000th power. Now remember, 10 to the 80th is a huge number. 10 to the 81st, remember, it's orders of magnitude, okay? So 10 to the 81st is 10 times 10 to the 80th. And 10 to the 82nd is 10 times 10 to the 81st. These are numbers that blow our mind, okay? Now, And we just take it for granted because the scientific community is just saying, well, it just happened. But they're kind of ignoring these probabilities. Now, you might say, well, and oh, by the way, never mind DNA, RNA, phospholipids, and all of the other infrastructure of the cell. Okay, these are just the proteins. Now, you'd say, well, it doesn't matter what probabilities you throw at me. We have a lot of time. Okay, we have a lot of time. That doesn't help. Basically, in the book, Signature in the Cell, Stephen Meyer talks about this as a probabilistic resource. You say, well, it's a really bad odds that Aunt Betty's going to win the lotto, but if she plays it enough, she might come up with a winning number. And that's what you would call probabilistic resources. So if you want to look at the probabilistic resources, okay, can we beat these odds? By having gobs of amino acids bonking into each other over the course of 13.7 billion years, which is the putative time of the Big Bang. Now, well, let's look at our probabilistic resources. How many seconds since the alleged Big Bang?
10 to the 16th.
Seconds. That's not a whole lot of time when you're looking at exponents, okay? That seems like a lot of time, but given the probabilities I just stated for a minimally complex cell to form really, really stripped down, and it probably wouldn't even work, okay? It's just not much time, okay? Maximum number of events per second. Now this will take some explaining. 10 to the 43rd events possible per second. Now what's an event? An event is when any elementary particle does something. Now the smallest event or smallest piece of time that you can squeeze an event into is 10 to the minus 43rd seconds. How did they get that number? 10 to the minus 43rd seconds has to do with Planck length. Now Planck length is the smallest quantum of distance. The smallest quantum of distance is 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. And Planck time is how long it takes this light to traverse that distance. Light goes pretty doggone fast. And how long it takes light to travel 10 to the minus 33 centimeters is Planck time. Okay? That's the smallest event that you can, that's the smallest piece of time you can squeeze. Now that's where they came up with 10 to the 43 events per second. Now that's a very high-end guess, and that's when you're talking about light traveling a very small distance as an event. If you actually look at amino acids and enzyme kinetics and amino acids bonking into each other, it's a lot fewer collisions per second than that kind of number, 10 to the 43rd. That's very, very, very ludicrously high. But we're wanting to really stack the deck in favor of the naturalist here as far as probabilistic resources. How many elementary particles in the known universe, I've already mentioned, is 10 to the 80th. So you add up all those exponents, total number of events since the origin of the universe is 10 to the 139th. Okay, so that's really, really generous because I see at the bottom the values of 10 to the 16th, 10 to the 43rd, 10 to the 80th are ludicrously generous. Obviously, the universe, most of the mass in the universe isn't going to be devoted into bonking amino acids together. Most of the mass in the universe is going to be gas in the form of stars and novas, supernovas, and all sorts of other celestial bodies. A very, very tiny fraction of that matter is going to be actually planets. And a very tiny fraction of the planets are going to have Earth-like planets with theoretically favorable for primordial soup. And a very tiny fraction of those planets are going to actually have this proposed soup on them. Okay? So the amount of atoms or actually molecules of amino acids, is going to be a tiny fraction of that 10 to the 80th. And of course, like I said, the amino acids bumping into each other, you're not going to get 10 to the 43rd collisions per second there. So that's a high number. And you subtract that from your odds, which is 10 to the 41,000th power, you're still at 1 chance in 10 to the 40,861. Okay, you just subtract your probabilistic resources. Still, these odds are so amazing. And you say, well, I'm a naturalist, dyed-in-the-wool naturalist. I don't care what the probabilities are. But you got to care. I mean, we know this is why we understand design. It's intuitive, it's rational, it's logical. When the first trade tower was hit in 9/11, a lot of people could say, what a tragic accident. Okay? Unlikely, but tragic accident. Second airliner hits within an hour, and everybody and their dog knows it's a design. Now, someone could say, wait, not so fast, not so hasty. Let's see, it was national security, big shot, said not so fast, not so hasty. Let's figure out the probabilities of 2 airliners hitting trade towers within an hour of each other by accident. That guy would be fired so fast, it would be funny, okay? Because when you get down to a certain level of probability, nowhere near this bad, everybody knows that it can't happen. Just intuitively, it can't happen. If it does happen, the automatic and most reasonable response to it should be design, unless you are axiomatically a naturalist and says, I don't care what the probability is, I'm not going to even consider supernaturalism or any kind of thing beyond nature. But you still have to deal with these probabilities. Now, those are the references. Douglas Axe, Estimating the Prevalence of Protein Sequences Adopting Functional Enzyme Folds. Journal of Molecular Biology, if you want that article. But it was summarized by Stephen Meyer in a big fat book called Signature in the Cell. Conclusions, and I know some of you won't like these conclusions, but naturalistic processes cannot generate matter. Okay, just first law. You have to kind of suspend that first law to get a point singularity out of nothing. Okay, you say, but the math works. Yeah, but the math is based on highly tenuous assumptions. Okay, we weren't there. Okay, and so when you're not there, your math might work, but the math is based on assumptions. And that's what I want you guys to walk. I'm not going to prove creationism. I'm not going to prove ID. Only lay people use that word prove indiscriminately. Okay? Scientists should say, okay, if you're going to stick with evidence, we need to get over these. If you're a naturalist, you need to rationally get over these hurdles. I don't think you can. Okay? So, but the alternative is ridiculous. It's the only option. Okay? Matter can't create itself, and dead matter to living matter has a really bad odds, and we don't have enough time in the known universe. Now, a lot of people say, well, maybe not in this universe. That's why people come up with a multiverse hypothesis. But then you're really not even on thin ice. You're not even empirical. You're not even being empirical. You're assuming another universe or an infinite number of universes just to get around the problem with probability. If you have an infinite number of universes, doesn't matter how bad the odds are, it's going to happen. But you have no empirical evidence for another universe. So you're just grasping. You're just grasping. Oh. If ever there was an appropriate time to use the word impossible, this is it. Okay? One cannot appeal to natural selection. A lot of people say naturalism can get me anything. It's a filter that takes what's there and filters out all the things that didn't work. The problem is when you're forming the first cell, you can't rely on natural selection, okay? Because you have to have a replicating entity. Once you get a replicating cell, once you get a cell that divides and reproduces itself, then presumably you're going to have some variants. Once you have some variants, then you can select which ones are more, which ones have the right stuff to survive better than the other variants. But before you have a reproducing entity, you have to just get there by brute probability. Just brute probability. Natural selection can't give you a leg up. Okay? The only known source of information is intelligence. Now, the study of genomes and DNA sequences is bioinformatics. It even has the word informatics. Okay? But in all of our empirical knowledge, in real systems, not in computers with algorithms, with they'll say this can generate information from, but some computer experts have looked at it, and there's embedded design in the algorithm that gives you a leg up. But if you're just dealing with raw matter to get you information, there's absolutely no empirical evidence that information can generate itself from no information. Now that's some of you know Shannon information. That doesn't count. I mean specified functional specified information. The information in living cells is overwhelming and is vastly superior to what our best software engineers can generate. Bill Gates knows that. Bill Gates has said DNA just, I don't know the exact quote, but he just said DNA is superior to what our best engineers can develop, okay, as far as information storage and retrieval. So, given these facts, I think a lot of us are herd animals. You might be a very bright naturalist, atheist, extremely bright. I'm not saying you aren't, but we're also herd animals. And when the bulk of if the mainstream's going this way, it takes a lot of independent thinking to actually cut against the current. What the prevailing paradigm is, you really have to think outside the box. You know, I got a card last week from, says, free thought. I'm all for it. Okay, think outside the box. Okay, think outside the box. Don't just be told what to think by the secular establishment or the scientific establishment. Yes, they're smart. And I'm not saying I'm smarter. I'm just saying that you have certain presuppositions that color your thinking. They're like glasses. And they shape the way you think. And I've got glasses too. I've got presuppositions that bias my thinking. We've all got biases. But we need to recognize those biases and say, okay, let's look at not look at what 99% of the scientific community is saying. They, like I said last week, they think very consistently given their premises. They're smart. They're not dumb. Okay, and if their premise is right, or their presuppositions are right, then their conclusions are probably right if they're thinking in a straight line. What I'm asking you to do is reconsider your premises. I think naturalism is not a good foundation. Let's see. Did I read that last? Why do we believe the scientific establishment, when it insists that genetic information and proteins happened apart from creative intelligence? They'll say it just happened apart because we can't see God. Well, I agree, we can't see God. We can't put God in a test tube. We can't see Him. We can't see how He created something out of nothing. But you naturalists are in the same boat. You don't know how a quantum flux created a point singularity of infinite density and infinite, out of nothing. That takes just as much faith, if not more. At least by definition, a God, by definition, can do it. Nature, by definition, or nature, we can pull the drawers down on nature, and it doesn't have a whole lot to offer, okay? Probabilistically. Claim, evolutionists, science-based, ID, and creationism is religion-based. Some people say God of the gaps. I want to say a little bit about that. God of the gaps is a nice alliteration, it's a nice quip. And I agree, there have been times in the past where if someone didn't understand some phenomenon, say a volcano, say God of the earth is losing his cool, or something like that. You don't understand something, you just say God did it. But I see that that's a problem for both sides, both groups, especially in the lay community. The lay community, they're not scientists, they'll say, well, God did it. I don't understand it, how, just God did it. But on the lay community, on the evolution side, they can say, evolution did it. I don't know how, just did it. So you can say, it's not a very good alliteration, but evolution did it, okay? Well, how did evolution do it? Well, okay, and now we can start discussing. But to just say that it's, I would say it's not God of the gaps. Here's why. For some of the reasons I've already said. God of the gaps says something you don't understand, you plug God in. In this case, it's something we do understand. In this case, it's saying we've looked at the roster of naturalistic processes, natural law, and we Rolodex through them, and they have been found wanting. Okay? Natural law doesn't generate the information needed to start life from non-life or to increase complexity of a very simple form of life into a more advanced form. Now, I would say that, yes, you can infer a design or a deity where you have found that natural law can't do it. You say, but that's faith. You bet it's faith. But it's smart faith. It's rational faith, because we can look at the evidence and go, nature doesn't do it. Nature doesn't do it. It can't. Okay? Say, but it can. But if you say it can, you're exercising just as much faith, and I'd say, and I would venture to say, you're actually exercising more irrational faith than I am. Okay? Because I can say God by definition can do it. You say, but you don't see God. You can't see God. You can't test God. You don't know His pH. You don't know anything about God. No, but God by definition can do the job. Nature, everything we know about nature, can't do the job. Both are a faith position. Both are a faith position. In science, your paradigm doesn't give you the answers. Okay? Rather, it is a set of presuppositions that helps you frame the questions that you want to ask. Scientific method is a standard logical procedure that enables us to answer questions about the natural world. Okay? Now, the scientific method, empirical science, is something that people who are working on historical science don't get to use much. Historical science is trying to figure out what happened in the past using data in the now. But you can't see the past, you can't go back, you can't repeat it, you can't see it, you can't test it directly. You can only look at circumstantial evidence, and you say, but this circumstantial evidence proves that, evolution happened. That's looking through your glasses. You're looking through your set of presuppositions. Now, I'm going to say something might shock a few creationists, but if you are right on naturalism, if naturalism is correct, then evolution is the best explanation for what we see. If naturalism is true, then of course, I've got a pentadactylous limb, and so does an ape, and so does all sorts of other animals. The lizard on my desktop, okay? A lot of animals, a lot of vertebrates have pentadactylous limbs. Now, if you're a naturalist, what's the best explanation? Evolution, of course. How else did we all get a radius, an ulna, humerus, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges, and have roughly the same patterns? Evolution is the only naturalistic, or the most rational naturalistic explanation for that. I'm asking you to question your presupposition. I know evolution's the best explanation given your premise. If I had to do my master's and my PhD in evolutionary universities, and I got grilled, and I had to get hand cramps writing evolutionary answers, and I can think like an evolutionist. I had to. So I could just put on my evolution head and just write like crazy on coevolution between insects and flowering plants, and write pages and pages and pages for my prelims. Okay? It's easy to think like an evolutionist given that presupposition. Okay, good scientists, and I want to reiterate this against what some of the more strident guys like Christopher Hitchens and Dawkins would say. I know not every evolutionist would say this, but good scientists are those who are masters of the method, the scientific method. They are not identified by which paradigm they pledge allegiance to. Okay? That would be different than what Dawkins would say. Dawkins would say anyone who doesn't believe in evolution is insane or stupid or whatever. I hope you know you're more nuanced than, or you see the subtle distinctions. It's not a matter of can these creationists think? Can these ID people think? Are they stupid? Are they missing? Is there a loose screw somewhere? Do they just not get it? I remember one of my professors, I will not say who, one of my professors, undergrad, said, "Gordon, can't you get it through your boneheaded skull, the concept of natural selection?" He said that. It was very politically incorrect. He hurt my feelings. No, he didn't. Can't you get it through your boneheaded skull? It's a good thing natural selection gave me a boneheaded skull, or I would have been offended by that. But it's not that we can't get it. We understand. Well, at least biologists that are creationists understand your theory. We do. We had to pass. We had to get a passing grade. So they're masters of the method. I know creationists who are very good scientists. They publish, and of course they can't publish about creation and their implications. They have to just play by the rules. They understand both sides, both both presets, both premises. They understand both. I think they're in a better position because a lot of evolutionists I know only know their side. They really, very few evolutionists actually understand the creationist side, or they kind of have a straw man version of it that's been stereotyped and caricatured to look like a political cartoon, makes the creationists look really, really stupid. They don't really understand. If you met some of the guys that I work with, these guys are very, very smart. They know both sides. They know the assumptions on both sides. They know the philosophy of science on both sides. And they believe what they believe for reasons, not because they're stupid or they've got a loose screw somewhere. Okay? Now, sauce for the goose. You know that term? Sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Anybody? Basically, sauce for the goose. It's basically saying you can't use a double standard. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. You can't just say, well, this applies to you guys, but doesn't apply to us. Demarcation criteria are criteria that philosophers of science have generated over the years that are an effort to try to separate science from pseudoscience. Okay? Now, most of the stuff about where we differ on is not empirical science. Where we differ is historical science. And Michael Ruse, who's a very famous philosopher of science, realized, I admire him for this, he realized that if you took these demarcation criteria, it is explainable by natural law, and you were strict about it, a lot of what he would say is real, true science would be discounted on that one, because not all, when you're building a theory of what happened in the past, not all of it is, you don't always explain it by natural law directly. Often things are explained by events. Now they may say the event happened and didn't violate natural law, but they would still say that it was an event or a scenario or conditions. It wasn't a natural law, brute natural law that did it. Example, in cosmology, cosmologists will often like in the solar system, we've got some interesting phenomena of certain planets that aren't rotating the right way. Okay, we've got a couple planets that have retrograde rotation. Some planets are out of tilt. Now, you can't just by sheer natural law of the nebula model come up with these oddball planets. So you have to invoke some things that aren't, they'll have to explain it by some, well, actually, this is more of the second one. Does it not invoke an unobservable entity? Certain things will just, you'll postulate, well, this unobservable entity had to be there to account for the solar system as it is, we see it. You say, but we don't see that. Where did it go? What knocked the glob we call the moon out from the Earth? Well, an asteroid hit it. Do we know how this unobservable entity? Okay, it's also a scenario. It's not natural law in and of itself. It's a process. It's a scenario that you just kind of postulate to explain something. Astronomers do it. They'll say, well, we'll just invoke some unobservable phenomenon to explain this part of the universe. Okay? And so they don't have empirical evidence for what they just postulated, but it helps explain what they see somewhere else. So science doesn't, and Michael Ruse saw that scientists will will use, and people that agree with him on the evolution side of things will use unobservable entities to explain certain phenomena. Not all of them were explainable by natural law. For example, if you're doing archaeology, some might say that's not a hard science, but still, if you're seeing hieroglyphics and you don't see the intelligent agents that carve in the rocks, that's not natural law. That natural law would be wind erosion, but we detect that it's an artifact of intelligence when we see hieroglyphs on sandstone. Okay? We didn't see the people who did it. We didn't see the Indian who did the arrowhead. Okay? But we can see the shape, and we can infer from the shape that natural processes don't generate that kind of shape. It's an artifact of mind. And you don't need to see the mind to know it. Now, this arrowhead is much more explainable by a piece of chert or obsidian bumping down a stream, being chipped into that shape. It's much more likely than the information that we see in genes of all living creatures. Okay? That is a much harder thing that we have to explain by natural law. But we can see something like this and go, obviously, somebody chipped that. Okay? It's testable. Makes predictions, is falsifiable. There's a number. If you're looking at the whole paradigm, yeah, paradigms are hard to falsify. They're like trying to kill Jabba the Hutt with airsoft guns. I mean, you can't just do this one key piece of evidence and knock down a whole paradigm. It's not falsifiable in that way. You're not going to come up with one test that falsifies evolution. Paradigms are huge, and they flex. They're much more flexible. But you can have discrete hypotheses within your paradigm that are very testable. I know I work with creationists, and they have testable hypotheses. Okay, they test them, and they are falsifiable. Okay, it's not like every good creationist theory. We're not that indiscriminate. Well, if it supports creation, it must be true. No. I'll give you an example. It's a historical science, like a lot of evolutionary science is historical. But one would be, well, I'll get to them in a little bit if I have time, but one would be some geologists that I know are working on the Coconino Sandstone of the Grand Canyon, which is a very light band near the rim. And it's a very widespread, it covers a lot of the United States. The Coconino Sandstone, according to conventional geology, was deposited by wind, aeolian. So it was because it's cross-bedded, so it's like dunes. So you've got layers like this. So it's a dune-type layer in the Grand Canyon. And the creationists, using their paradigm, said, we believe it's water deposited. Now, they weren't going to say Noah's flood because they were presenting at the Geological Society of America. Okay? It's totally secular. But they had a very testable, discrete hypothesis that says, we're going against all of conventional geology, and we're saying that the Coconino Sandstone is water deposited. It's water dunes, it's not wind dunes. And they did microsections of the rock. They did hardcore geology. They were all trained geologists, PhDs in respectable secular schools, and they did geology the way geologists would do it. And it was peer-reviewed by secular geologists. Did it prove creation? No. But it was a testable hypothesis that says we're going to cut against the whole convention of geology and say that this was water deposited. They the GSA thought it was really good science. They had a lot of people came to their sessions, mostly because they knew that they were, how did these creationists get into this august body of scientists? But it was good work, okay? Another guy, Leonard Brand, who's a paleontologist at Loma Linda University, his paradigm said that these sediments that were formed over supposedly vast eons of time, he believed were deposited rapidly. The reason why is in Peru, there's this famous bed, trying to remember the bed, Pisco Formation in Peru. It's got hundreds of beautifully fossilized whales, all in diatomaceous siltstone. Now, diatomaceous ooze forms very conventionally, very, very slowly. But Leonard Brand did some taphonomy, which is the study of decaying animals. And he says whales decay and are totally taken out in a year or two at the bottom of the ocean. So you're not going to cover up a whale in diatomaceous sediment forming at millimeters per year and have it fossilize. So he did research and proposed that this diatomaceous siltstone formed very rapidly in Peru, and because that's the only way you're going to get whales fossilized, if you rapidly bury them deep. If you go slow, they're going to be totally taken out by scavengers. So it was peer-reviewed. In fact, it was peer-reviewed by Geology Journal, which is their premier journal. It's kind of like Cell for biologists and Geology for geologists. It's a big journal. He got the cover story. His research was the cover article, and he was a creationist. Of course, he didn't say anything about creation in the article. He just did his research. It was based on his presuppositions. And his evolutionary colleagues that were working with him and collaborated in some cases with him said, we think you're all wet about creation, Leonard, but you know what? Your presuppositions about the world cause you to ask questions we would never ask. And you do good research, but we would have never asked that question. His presupposition, on the earlier slide, your presuppositions help you frame different questions the evolutionists would have never thought of asking. He asked that question, he did good research, and got on the cover of Geology. So it's not a fruitless area of research. We can ask questions and we can test them. It's falsifiable, it makes predictions. There's lots of creationist theories that have been falsified. I don't just say they're true because they're creationists. There's lots of falsified creationist theories or hypotheses that have been tested and shown wanting. It's falsifiable. Now you'd say, well, the whole thing isn't falsifiable. Maybe not, but I would also ask, is evolution? I mean, evolution's, you can...
The Precambrian rabbit fossil.
Yeah, that's a good one. That would be nice. Precambrian rabbit fossil. I'll look for it. Okay, well, I want to get on to, you can ask me about that last one. Let's see. Claim, uniformitarianism is a reliable presupposition. Uniformitarianism says that we figure out the ages of past events or past structures by rates that we see today. So we can figure out how long the hourglass has been trickling because we can know, how much started in the top, how much is in the bottom bin, and the rate of trickle. And if we know all of those things, then we can figure out how long that hourglass has been sitting there in that position. Okay? But uniformitarianism, that's the claim. I would say it's not a reliable position. Just a few, and this is just a handful that I wanted to pick. Big problems with uniformitarianism. Evidence for accelerated decay in zircon crystals in New Mexico, the Beartooth Mountains of New Mexico. Did some cores of granite. In granite, there are these little crystals called zircon crystals. They're about 250 microns long. And you can do radiometric dating, okay? Now, radiometric dating, if you go back to the hourglass, in a very loose analogy, the parent, like the top bin, would decay into the daughter, the bottom bin. If you know the rate of decay, then you can figure out how long it's been trickling. And the trickle would be the radioactive decay. Of course, the half-life wouldn't work with that hourglass model, okay? Now, U-238 decays into lead-206. They actually looked at the ratio of the parent to daughter, and that the ratio of U-238 to lead-206 showed that the zircon was 1.5 billion years old. Okay. Also, when it decays, get this little laser. When it decays, the U-238 goes through eight decay steps, releasing an alpha part. It's alpha decay, and alpha is, anybody know what an alpha? Alpha particles, 2 protons and 2 neutrons. When the alpha particle is shot out from the nucleus, it picks up a couple of electrons and becomes a helium atom. So when U-238 is decaying into lead-206, one atom, making it all the way down to lead, releases 8 helium atoms. Now, it's a crystal, so the helium's trapped, kind of. But just like it does out of balloons, helium leaks. It leaks a lot slower in crystal than it does out of your mylar balloon, but it leaks. Now, if you look at that decay, you can actually calculate how much helium actually was generated in that decay. You can look at how much lead and how much uranium, how much lead, and how much helium was actually produced from that decay. In the crystal, there's still large amounts of helium. And basically, if the rock was 1.5 billion years old, there should be none. It should have all leaked out. They figured out how much total helium was made, and then they figured out how much was still remaining in the crystal, and it turned out that based on how much has remained and how much is left, about 6,000 years worth it was gone. So you can't just take all uniformitarian rates. You take the one or the other, you can't take both. Because if you look at helium diffusivity, we can measure the rate of helium under different temperature regimes. They've plotted that. And it turns out that a uniformitarian rate that assumes that the rock is 1.5 billion years old has to maintain that helium diffuses about 100,000 times slower than it actually does. 100,000 times slower than it actually does. So you could say, well, the helium diffused slower in the past. Well, both can play that game. I can say, no, there was an accelerated decay at a point in history, unobserved past. You say, well, then you have no evidence that uranium decayed really fast. I could also say you have no evidence that helium diffuses really, 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 really slow. So you pick one or the other. You can't just pick both and say evolution is, or geologic time is true. We both can use both halves of this story contradict each other based on, if you're accepting uniformitarianism completely, both halves of the story are in contradiction. One either accelerated or one diffused slow, really slow. So These are just things that make you think. Does that prove a young Earth? No, it doesn't prove a young Earth. It just says that things aren't as tidy as we would like. And often we just shove aside a lot of the anomalous data, and it's just... by the way, you say, well, that's not an acceptable journal. No, but the lab who did the lab that did the analysis of the helium and the uranium and the lead, that was a secular lab.
Well, probably tested it again too.
Yeah, a state-of-the-art lab, and they made sure that the RATE project, which was done by these guys, Steve Austin, John Baumgartner, Andrew Snelling, they all made sure that you do this right. Do the best you can with this sample. I already talked about the whales in a diatomaceous siltstone. Here's the article in Geology. That was 2004. Cover article. This one's a really good one, and I'll try to wrap it up here. Half-life of carbon-14. It's a very short half-life, 5,730 years, and it's not used to date anything presumed to be over 50,000. A lot of people use carbon-14 synonymously with radiometric dating, and that's just wrong. Hardly anything is dated by carbon-14 if you're dealing with millions of years, okay? Well, they don't use, if they think it's millions of years, they don't use carbon-14. They only use it for like human artifacts and stuff, things that they think are under 50,000. Now the RATE project, and this goes back to presuppositions, the RATE project with Andrew Snelling, John Baumgartner, and all these guys, and they've got their PhDs in reputable schools in geology and geophysics. They had labs test for coal. Now these samples were 34 million, between 34 million and 311 million years old. That's what was thought. That's how old the coal was. But it had C14 in them. There should be not even a slight amount of C14. It's gone through too many half-lives. You shouldn't even be able to detect C14. But they had appreciable amounts of carbon-14 in them. In fact, they had diamond tested, and some diamonds were assumed to be over 1 billion years old according to conventional dating, and they had C14 in them. And that just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's not as old as you think, or the half-life changed, okay? Either way, you're in trouble. You either have to say, my uniformitarianism is on the rocks, no pun intended, or it's a lot younger than I thought. And that's article John Baumgartner. We'll skip over that. And I'm not saying that proves anything. I'm just saying it should make you pause to have soft tissue and T-rex femur. They come up to say that it can be sitting in a femur for close to 70 million years and not mineralize. I'm not going to go, oh. I'm just saying we should think about that one for a little bit. Okay? It's kind of hard to think, even though it's a big bone, I understand it's a big bone and it can insulate from a lot of the elements and stuff, and you can come up with scenarios that protected the tissue. That's an awfully long time. Okay? And you say, well, you didn't prove it's young. No, I didn't prove anything. I'm just saying it fits more with a young age than an old one. Okay? It's not as shocking to someone who believes in a younger Earth. I'll do one more and just quit, even though rate of recession of the moon, another uniformitarian rate, it's receding at 1.6 inches per year. If it started out touching the Earth, it would reach its current position in 1.37 billion years. Now the moon is supposed to be 4.5, something like that, billion years old. If it was receding at that rate, it should have gone away or gotten way far out there and left. It shouldn't be this close. Given the rate of 1.6 inches of recession a year. Now the Roche limit, it can't start touching the Earth because the Roche limit, 11,500 miles, is the limit at which you can't get any closer. If the moon was any closer than that, the tidal forces would break up the Earth. We've got tidal forces that move our oceans around, but if it's that close, it would start to just rip apart our planet. So the Roche, it has to at least start at 11,500 miles and then move out from there. Okay? Well, there's all sorts of fun stuff. I'm just scraping the surface. Did I prove it? No, I didn't prove it. I'm just saying we should look at not just the data that fits your paradigm. There are other data that disturb it, shake the foundations of your paradigm. And I think we should look at those things seriously and hard and say, is my assumed paradigm, my assumed premises, my assumed presuppositions, are they as solid as I think? Okay? That's all I'm asking you to do. And also to talk amiably with someone who differs. Thanks. So, do we have, what's the drill? We'll just open it for questions for 15, 20 minutes, and then I'll hang around for as long as people are around after that. Yeah.
I liked how you at the start said that you're like basing everything on probabilities, but there's one probability that you didn't recognize. We talked about this earlier, that I'm into biology, and one probability that you didn't specify was the probability of endogenous retroviral insertion points being found in both chimpanzees and
retroviruses in chimps.
Yes.
Okay.
And we share approximately around 30,000 ERVs in the exact same locations as chimps and humans. The odds of that happening are so low that it's like winning the lottery 30,000 times in a month.
Okay, yeah.
And plus the fact that we share chromosome number 2, which is found in the human genome, which is a fusion of 2 A chromosomes.
Okay.
How we know that's a fusion is that there's telomeres on the outside and telomere right in the center, while it has centromeres on either side of the telomeres.
Okay. I understand that.
And we can find, well, I'm telling everyone else.
Okay, yeah, gotcha.
I'm making sure all the lay people know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So they're not lost.
Yeah.
And you find the 8 chromosomes split apart in eggs, as in a not fused stage. And we also find cytochrome C as well, which we find that they have amino acid similarities.
Yeah.
And then we also find atavisms as well, which are evolutionary throwbacks.
Do you want to do all of them, or do you want to address?
I'm speaking about
Pick one. There's a little bit of time here.
Yeah, I know. I'm speaking about the odds of all this coming together, because this is synthesis of evidence, not just one or the
But
other.
I agree. But the thing is, again, you're bringing your presuppositions, whether it's homology, amino acid sequence, or DNA sequence, and assuming that these homologies imply common ancestry, and the endogenous retroviruses that are in there, you're assuming that this is kind of a picture of evolutionary history, and that obviously we diverged from a common ancestor, or we wouldn't have had all of these pieces of DNA in those same exact positions in both groups had they not diverged. But that's assuming that a lot of it's junk DNA. Okay, that's basically kind of showing the genetic history of all of the kind of like genetic atavisms, where you've got these insertions that hit. But that's assuming that this is just junk DNA that has no function. Now, from a design perspective, if you have a design presupposition, I know I have a similar morphology on pentadactylus limb as a chimp. Now, from a naturalist perspective, you'd say, well, common ancestry, because that's a similar structure. It's the same argument whether it's genes, proteins, or morphology. The same basic argument is saying, well, it's either common ancestry or common design. Now you say, well, it can't be common design because these are just junk DNA. But they're finding out that a lot of these things are not translated, they are transcribed. They are transcribed, and they're finding out that a lot of this supposed junk DNA has functionality still that are involved in all sorts of regulation, gene regulation. And we haven't figured it all out, but there's a lot more supposed junk DNA that's not junk. And so a creationist perspective is not assuming that all of this is junk DNA. They were designed, and yeah, why reinvent a whole totally different karyotype, whole different chromosome layout for things that are very similar? Of course I would expect my DNA to be very similar to a primate. Okay, if you have two buildings that look a lot alike, I would expect the blueprints to look a lot alike. But that doesn't imply that they came from a common ancestor, but you can say common design. And so even those things, you're presuming
endogenous retroviruses are not transcribed.
Some are. Okay?
Okay.
Endogenous retroviruses undergo a process of...
There are some that are actually transcribed and involved in, there's one that was involved in, they don't know what it does exactly yet, but it's transcribed at a certain ovarian cycle. And so in the ovarian cycle, there's certain transcripts of certain, what's the acronym?
Endogenous retroviruses,
Yeah.
ERVs.
They're actually reverse transcribed because
Right.
of the retro part from an enzyme called
Reverse transcriptase. Right.
The reason I was saying that there's so much evidence for it, that is because you were talking about probabilities, and the probability of that actually happening is so low that
If you're right about it being junk DNA.
well, no, ERVs are actually not junk DNA. Viruses play a huge role in evolutionary change. Viruses actually play an incredible role, same with like conjugation in bacterial cells. It plays an incredible role. It's anything that deals with allele frequency change over time. And that the odds of actually, because I'm not saying ERVs are junk DNA at all, I'm saying that they affect our evolutionary...
yeah, but can you also say, from a design perspective, that these were placed in there at creation? Now, you can, from a creationist perspective, I would say that the different kinds, even things that look very morphologically similar, can have very, very similar homology in DNA or protein. And so when you tell me ERVs imply common ancestry because of their exact positions in the genes, that doesn't prove anything. It can be common design, or it can be common ancestry. It depends on your presuppositions. And you say, well, I'm a naturalist, and that's where we would part company. But common design also can explain those similarities. I don't think, if you think of cars, you can say, well, Beamers have steering wheels and Fords have steering wheels. They're not technically homologous, but they are serving the same role in both automobiles, but one's a totally different make, okay? And it's the same with organisms. You can have a lot of the same things that evolutionists would say common ancestry, because that's why they're similar. The dashboard's similar, therefore common ancestry. No, common design. Common design based on the fact that we need to, the organism needs to function, and why reinvent the wheel totally differently, okay? So I see your point, but I'm just saying that the probability problem goes away if you say that they were designed in a similar pattern for a very similar reason, to keep both organisms alive, okay, functionally alive, and having them in the very similar genetic blueprint. So, but I give chance for other, yeah.
Actually, I had a quick comment. You said earlier that matter can't, come out of nowhere. That's actually not true. If you're familiar with Hawking's radiation, it's when a particle is emitted from a black hole at the event horizon. And what that happens, or how that happens, is a particle comes into existence, half of it escapes the black hole, and the other half gets sucked in. So,
Now, I would like to see how much of that is theoretical and how much of that is observational.
It is actually observable from black holes. That's the only radiation that they can detect from black holes.
Okay, but how do they know that it came from nothing? You don't know what's going on in.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Granted, I'm not a
Right, astronomer.
PhD, physicist or astronomer.
Neither am I. So.
But I'd be happy to share some research on it.
Sure. Yeah, Matt.
Is intelligent design a theory?
Okay, it
A
would.
scientific theory?
Yeah, I would say yeah.
And so you started last week talking about, kind of the differences between evolutionists and creationists, or intelligent design.
Yeah, there's a difference between creationists
and that's it seems like definition and vocabulary are areas where we don't agree. That scientific theory, to me, can't apply to intelligent design, and that natural history, a part of which evolution is, can't include supernatural components. That if evolution considered a supernatural component, it would cease to be science.
It would cease to be natural. Now, if you look at
But it would cease to be science. I mean, science is the observable. It's a very structured, formal thing. It's
a structured, but
it's not up for grabs what's included. And
well,
including supernatural, you describe something different that can't have the label of life science.
It's going back to philosophy of science, inference to the best explanation. We know in every other logical, where we detect design, where we would all agree it's design, okay? Whether it's forensics, whether it's archaeology, we can detect design, and everybody knows it's design, and no one questions it, okay? Because it's it's the artifact of human mind. But we automatically just kind of dismiss it as if it's not human mind that made that or generated that, then we automatically say we can't make that inference. How so? Now, like I said before, intelligent design does not mandate that it has to be a supernatural designer. Now, I think that is just a couple logical steps after, and then you get to supernatural, because you wind up in this goofy infinite regression of natural aliens designing us, and I think that's just, it leads to the inevitable, which is something beyond the physical. But inference to the best explanation is a valid scientific reasoning method that we bring to a lot of different disciplines. Forensics, I don't know, SETI, I don't know much about SETI, but they would say we can detect design in some sort of, if there was actual code coming from another planet and it wasn't just a pulsar, we could detect it as intelligent code from a alien race. Now they know they can detect that, but that would be, you can say, well, intelligent design's not science, but they might not be ID people, but they would still say, hey, wait a minute, if you chuck
if you chuck out intelligent design, that means you're telling me we can't detect design when we hear code from another planet, if there is life out there. So.
I mean, I don't know, that one would take some convincing. It's a little.
Yeah, but I think the main problem.
I still can't get past the call for supernaturalism in a natural science.
Well, okay, in a natural science, what you have to do is look at all of the naturalistic explanations for a particular phenomenon. If they come up, if all of them empirically, we should go where at first, if the data says, okay, we can get information and we can get spontaneous generation and things just happen, then yeah, we need to, the ID people would be on.
Those are acceptable gaps in evolution. That
Yeah.
Evolution doesn't describe the primordial soup. It doesn't propose how life was created.
Right, but
Again, it
a
doesn't
true.
propose anything about astronomy or the universe.
Yeah.
And
But a true natural science should go, at least tentatively, say, let's go with what the data says now.
the data says we don't know.
No, the data says the only thing that can generate information right now is intelligence. So what's wrong with just?
Isn't that the God of the gaps argument?
No,
I mean,
because we know.
If we can't explain it, the Sky Daddy did it. I mean,
No.
that's the.
We can say, okay, if you hold out for a naturalistic explanation, you're going to be fine, but you're going to be waiting around for an awful long time. Because
Yeah, I don't expect science to ever explain the origins of life. The evolution explains
okay,
the
but
diversity of species,
but
the
science is
origin
trying to look for truth. And if this is a kind of a big cosmic riddle, and we're trying to figure out how, and there is a possibility that there is a something metaphysical beyond nature, but our conventions of science arbitrarily rule it out, then you say that science is simply a game to try to describe all natural phenomena. It's kind of like, let's say you lost.
That's not arbitrarily ruling it
Well,
out. It's declared to be natural, observable.
Let's say you lost.
empirical evidence.
Let's say you lost the keys. Let's say you lost your car keys over across the street where it's dark,
Mhm.
and the street light's here. Okay, and so you're just looking around where the street light is. You say, well, you dropped them over there. You got to look over where it's dark. I can't find them in the dark. I'm only going to look where there's light. Now we could say that science, the tools of science are kind of where the light is. Okay?
I wouldn't find my keys. Yeah.
You wouldn't find your
But
keys.
I wouldn't assume that God took them. I mean,
No, but I'm saying that sometimes you have to, if natural phenomena cannot account, and it seems like we know enough about natural phenomena that it doesn't look like it really, the more we learn, it's not going to get better. Because when we study cell biology, the complexity just keeps getting deeper and deeper. We keep on peeling off layers. It gets more and more complex. And the little toolbox of evolution still stays pretty much mutation, natural selection, and nothing wrong with that, but it's very limited in its scope of what it can do. And we can actually measure what it can do.
That's intentional. I mean, I guess I brought this up as a spot where clearly we disagree.
Yeah.
When we're searching for the areas we disagree, it's not on the Roche limit, and
Right.
it's sort of on biology, but it's really these fundamental things.
The fundamental things are methodological naturalism.
It's the God of the gaps. It's the request for supernaturalism in a natural science.
Well,
and it's fudgy words that use theory and hypothesis and fact.
Well-
And then it's confusion between evolution and Darwinism.
Oh, yeah, I
The things
understand.
over 100 years apart.
Oh, yeah, I know.
Entirely different.
It's not entirely, there's still Darwinism in the modern sense.
Darwinism was at best a hypothesis.
Okay,
I mean,
well, the way they celebrate is,
But once we could explain, once science discovered DNA, it rapidly approached theory, and can be considered fact, but I would call it theory. I mean, because it's science, it's a strict paradigm,
Well,
and it will remain theory forever,
Right.
because it can't progress to fact. But
Well, if you look at it, science didn't drop out of the sky shrink wrapped. It was
so
a
it's
process.
self-evident from nature.
But no,
But all intelligent
but
beings
all the
create
people
science.
and the architects of science,
Mhm.
all the great men that we name our units after, you know, all of those guys would look at today's strident naturalism as laughable. Newton, a lot of these guys, and say, well, they're kind of
They were pre-science, mostly ignorant people, but they came up. I mean, Newton knew nothing about the world compared to now.
Well, yeah,
knew
but they
at their
weren't
time,
dolts.
They were intelligent, but from our perspective, they knew almost nothing. I mean.
Well, yeah, but they
we
were
wouldn't
smarter.
look to them for medicine. That
No,
would be
no, I understand that. I understand that, but I would love to be as smart as Newton and Galileo. Yes, they didn't have the accumulated evidence, but science grew out of the belief that God created the universe in an orderly, understandable way so that science was possible. And all of these architects of science, you'd say, well, they were still gripped with supernatural or superstitions and things like that. They actually believed in God, so they were obviously not enlightened. And I think we should go back and look at the roots of science and actually say, these guys knew more philosophy of science than we do. And I think we don't look at our foundations enough. We don't look at our presuppositions enough. We say, well, you're right, the conventions of science say they rule out, it's methodological naturalism, they rule out any kind of inference to any kind of design or supernatural entity. But I'm saying, if science includes thinking logically and navigating through it, I think that to limit yourself to a naturalistic philosophy that says we can only consider natural phenomenon and we must not invoke anything else, when maybe we're here for a reason. Maybe we are here for a purpose. Does it take faith? Yes. But it also takes faith to believe that you're a strident naturalistic commitment. We have to be scientific, and we can't, if you discount the other, you're going to, it's going to be a science that's not going to go anywhere.
And that's why, I mean, that's why I don't attempt to argue the biology, is because, I mean, really our differences are that fundamental thing.
Yeah.
It's
the philosophy.
What science is to us, and science for me is all natural. It's self-evident. It's something that any intelligent life form would discover, that had evolution occurred for that life form, they would discover it, because it's rational self-analysis.
Yeah, it's but like you said, rational, but when you have to opt for
supernatural, which for me is not rational.
If you rationally hold to those probabilities, saying, well, nature can
I have this whole separate argument for that. I mean, that's why I say it's not worth arguing, or I mean, it's worth, but it's short time that's a separate thing from this part where we differ, which is the request for supernaturalism and natural science, our understanding of where science came from.
Well, would you say forensic and I'll wrap it up so we can informally break and you leave if you have to, but would you say forensic and archaeology, you can't infer design in past artifacts? You can't infer?
But in those cases, we know that humans design things.
But we don't see them. And just because they're humans, doesn't mean that the thinking, the rational thinking to get to that conclusion is faulty. Now, just because humans didn't do it doesn't mean that it's faulty thinking to come up with a design inference. And so this is where I think people just stop and say, well, if I wind up saying aliens or God, it's just not science. But no, inference to the best explanation goes with design. Now you say, well, if I go to theism, yes, I'm taking leaps of faith. I'm going outside of Christianity is not intelligent design. Intelligent design only maintains that we can detect design in nature. Okay, once you get past that and then step into faith in God, you're outside of science, granted. You're totally outside of science. Doesn't mean it's irrational, but you're outside of science. All I'm saying is that ID is an inference to the best explanation based on what we know of information and what we know of what natural law can do. So you can feel free to ask more questions, but I think there might be. Dave?
Yeah, sure. How you doing?
Hi. Good to see you.
I'm curious. We've talked quite a bit. And,
Oh, a little bit.
yeah, we disagree on some things, but I was disappointed that there wasn't more biology in your presentation. And I'm curious why you use so many. I know you're a biologist. You're a
Right.
PhD. You're not a physicist. You're not a geologist. You're not an
Right.
astrophysicist. Why do you use so many of those examples when you talk about
Good.
intelligent design, which is really trying to counter evolution?
Good question. I prefer to talk biology, but on talking about these particular presuppositions, I did talk a little bit about biology with the minimally complex cell.
Yeah, I'm curious about that.
Okay. These other ones was more talking about uniformitarianism, which is another thing that is a very important foundation for at least the geologic time, which gave Darwin the time he needed for biological evolution. That's why he liked the Principles of Geology by Lyell. It gave him the time frame to work with for his theory. And so I went through some of the things that basically say this is not this impenetrable fortress of a presupposition. I think a lot of modern evolutionary thought is built on those two presuppositions. And like I said, a lot of scientists have built logically on it with their bricks, but I think the foundation of it is really shaky. And that's why I like to question the very corners, the foundations of it all. I do like to talk about, I've got a bunch of other talks that have lots of biology in it. And I've given several of them, whether irreducible complexity and arguments, counter-arguments, back and forth. And things. So yeah, I'm all for biology. I kind of just did this because I thought they were important presuppositions to hit. And actually, yeah, and I could have hit I could have had more arguments in biology against uniformitarianism. Could have done that. Yeah.
This is actually talking about.
Oh yeah, let's officially be done.
I actually like people to hear this. I
Oh.
promise I'll be quick.
Okay.
Did you go back to your minimum complexity cell? I just want to make sure I'm quoting you wrong. Okay. So I appreciate your logic with the probabilities and everything, but I like to point out your assumption that the minimally complex cell is by today's standards.
Well, this is what we have to go on, is can we get, this is where the burden or the onus is on the biologist who maintains that naturalist process can generate a cell. Okay,
But
you can say,
cells-
well, it can get simpler, but this is where you get into some of the irreducible complexity. I'm not saying the cell's irreducibly complex, but I think that I think we have to test and do a lot of knockout mutations to say what is just fine-tuning of cellular machinery and what is essential. And you can't just build a cell a protein at a time. There's a certain number. I think that's a very generously low.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But your assumption is that a cell was the first life.
I'd say it'd have to, well, I don't even think that 250 proteins is really a cell. That is ridiculously simple. I'm just basically saying 250 proteins, only one copy each. That is not a cell. Like I said, this probability doesn't even factor in some of the informational biomolecules. I always think it's riotous when they say, well, it was an RNA world. Well, you know, proteins are the best for primordial soup experiments. These are horrible. These are horrible as far as getting a nucleotide. You got to have the phosphate, the sugar, and the base hooked right together with the hooked to the right carbons. So you got to get the nucleotide right. Then you have to start chaining those up. And I'm saying, you just assume an RNA world? Come on, get me an RNA. Get me a polynucleotide. I don't care if it's a random sequence. Get me a polynucleotide.
Well, they have created two of those, two of those nucleides in labs so far.
Of the bases?
Two of the bases, yes.
Yeah, it's two of the bases. I understand, yeah. But actually, I would really recommend you read a book called Mystery of Life's Origins by Thaxton, Bradley, and Olson. They're three organic chemists, and they basically just go through the organic chemistry in pretty gnarly detail, showing that even the best case scenarios of primordial soup just get, it's like having your alphabet soup. If you walked into the bathroom and came out and you had to be or not to be written in your noodle alphabet soup on your roommate arranged the letters while you were in the bathroom. Now the noodles do not violate any laws of chemistry, right? They are sticking to each other according to cohesion of noodle particles to noodle particles. But they're not mystical. It's not mystical. There's no supernatural thing going on here. Laws of chemistry of noodles and broth, but noodle and broth chemistry don't make the sentence. And neither do the laws of mass action stick amino acids together in a way that's going to be functionally specified, nor nucleotides together functionally specified. This is why I did this. I know I repeated this slide from last year. I will repeat it next year. I figured some people this was new. I'm going to keep using this because this is my queen on the chessboard. And I'm going to keep using this queen because it has lots of lines of force radiating out from it. I think we should probably officially end, and I'd be happy if you want other people to hear your questions because they're so wonderful. Feel free, if you want to hear these questions, stick around informally afterwards and hear me or see me get tarred and feathered or whatever.